Good morning and welcome to the Core Connection. I'm Mira Rubin here with you on Enlightened World Network. And today's topic is strength of mind. And what does it take to choose life affirming thoughts and patterns? So it should be an interesting conversation. Before we get started, let's take a moment to get present. Let's take a deep breath in through your nose and hold it. And imagine clean, crisp oxygen flooding your lungs, flowing into your bloodstream, nourishing all your cells and all your organs, and bringing vital life energy to your body and being. And as you exhale any tension, stress, negativity, fatigue. And now let's take another deep breath in through your nose and hold it. This time, imagine brilliant, bright light lighting you up from the inside out, illuminating, electrifying, and energizing all your cells, all your molecules, your electrons, creating a brilliant beam of light and energy from your heart out into the world. And as you exhale any remaining tension, stress, negativity, fatigue. And now let's press our palms together. Vigorously rub your hands together to feel the friction, the temperature, the motion, the pressure, and the tickling and tingling when you stop. Allow all those sensations to bring you present right here, right now, into this remarkable physical form that enables you to experience life. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Good morning, Rosalind. Great to have you here with us this morning, and good morning to everybody else who's joining us. Today, we're talking about strength of mind, and this conversation comes from speaking with a client and friend who has been wrestling with sort of a repetitive thought, personal torture. In a breakup of a relationship where what keeps arising is the thoughts around loss and rumination. Rumination, that's such a great word. In fact, I think I'm going to look it up, but I think cows are called ruminants, I think, because they chew their cud. And so rumination is kind of like going over and chewing over an idea over and over and over. I'm just going to look it up here. Rumination. The act of pondering or musing on something written or spoken that expresses such pondering or musing, and the act or process of chewing the cud as cows, deer, and other animals do. So when we think about how we contend with certain instances of life or situations in life, and we just go back over and over and over and keep digging the trench more deeply, right? We have this pattern of thinking, and the more we repeat it, the more deeply ingrained the pattern comes. Like, when we say entrenched, if you run a vehicle, the wheels over the same terrain over and over, it creates a rut. It deepens the rut with each passage of the wheels, right? So this is what we do when we ruminate and practice, essentially, these patterns. It's awesome when we practice life affirming patterns, but typically what we do is we practice these negative patterns that just dig us more deeply into a rut that makes living much more difficult, that creates our own suffering and sadness. And then we do it in a habitual way. And it's just so fascinating to see myself when I do that, to see it in others. It's maddening, right? Because it's just like, it hurts when I'm banging my head against the wall. Stop banging your head against the wall. So the thing is that somehow it's not necessarily that easy to just say, well, stop. And it requires, because it is this habituated pattern, and it requires a deliberate discipline to turn your head to a different direction. And I remember when I was going through deep, deep, deep depression for a long time in my life, but I remember one time in particular where I just was so depressed, and I don't even know what the life circumstances were, but I had to make deliberate, disciplined choices to shift my being, to shift my behavior. And I know I've shared this with you before, but I remember one time in particular where I was in the shower crying and singing to try to lift my frequency even just a little. And it was a deliberate, conscious act of will to do that, because otherwise I was just going to continue down that road and dig myself deeper and deeper into this pattern of despair. And so watching this person, it's been very interesting, because they are wrestling with shifting this lifelong pattern. And interestingly, in their presencing themselves to the pattern and to the behavior and the circumstances, they're recognizing certain patterns that are even more deeply entrenched, that are informing this cyclical, kind of obsessive rumination, and how there was such a deep confusion of mixed messages around love and around caring. And this brings us to another level of patterning, that when we grow up in toxic environments where pain and love are intermingled, where domination and love are intermingled, we incorporate these mixed messages as our foundation, as our foundational definition of what love might be, or what relationship might be, or what's appropriate and what's not appropriate. And it takes conscious attention to be deciphering or even recognizing these patterns. So for this person, there are all kinds of revelations. They grew up in an abusive environment, and there are all kinds of revelations that are arising, that are informing their work with, I was going to say struggle with, and it is moments of struggle, but not entirely. Their attention to these issues, in their attention to these issues on the deeper level, it's empowering them further to recognize the dysfunction, to be able to start making other choices, to be able to start bringing compassion to themselves and their younger selves, to be helping to untangle. So the thing is that when we don't have a model for a healthy relationship, how do we cultivate that? So this is, and interestingly, we have so many messages, like through media. There are all these fairy tale sorts of stories, especially for little girls growing up, all kinds of fairy tales about, at least in my era, that Prince Charming was going to come and rescue. And so when you don't have a model for a healthy relationship, what do you hold on to, or what do you embrace? These fairy tales. And then life doesn't live up to the fairy tale. And so there's this strength of mind and courage of heart that we're called to bring to our journeys of transformation and growth and healing toward wholeness. The thing about these dysfunctional messages that we receive when we're children, that's what we're imprinted with. It's not something that has to be forever, but if it's not to be forever, it takes a lot of work to first unearth those things and then to address them. And we tend to address them from the symptom downward. It's rare that we can identify the source and clear that, though sometimes we can clear the source and everything else bubbles up from there. But we've talked about the spiral of change and transformation, and that's because there are all these different levels to the issues that we're confronted with, that as we start peeling them back, we gain a greater capability to recognize what some of the dynamics are, and new dynamics, well, not new, but new to us, become apparent. These deeply entrenched patterns. So Rosalind says, visualization during a meditation. Can you picture your sage self visiting you and giving you a message? When in that space, what message would she bring? Maybe a message will come when the mind is in a calm space. I love that, Rosalind. That's actually a technique that I do a lot with clients when they're experiencing trauma. It's often it often feels like it's in this moment, and in fact, I'll often say, and how old are you? And it turns out that they're 5 years old or 13 years old or whatever. And then we get to recognize that child self, and we bring the present self as the sage self to that child. Oftentimes the present self is able to know that child survived, and is able to share the richness, or just the faith or the love or the compassion, just to be able to be present, the strength, whatever, to share with that child who was so deeply traumatized. And it's very healing for the child and for the adult. It ends up going both ways. It's really, really fascinating. And it's important to recognize that our mind doesn't make a distinction between what's real and what's vividly imagined. So if we can vividly imagine guides or our sage self or other figures or personalities coming into a situation, when we are present to that reimagination, then it shifts our being. And in its way, time doesn't exist, because the past is something that we remanufacture in this moment. You know, we have certain memories, we have certain interpretations, and then we remanufacture them. It's how we repetitively ruminate on different experiences, and sometimes those experiences are beyond conscious awareness. In fact, that's often the case. And then there's something that happens, and there's a trigger, and bammo, we're in another world and not present anymore. We're operating out of being 13 or 5 or 2, whatever it is, because that instance was never healed. And oftentimes we believe that something is inconsequential or complete, when in fact it has just been segregated from our actual our current awareness. But it doesn't mean it's not operative. So Rosalind says, sounds like your guidance is very healing and transmutes pain, shifted into a different space. What changes? The thoughts don't trigger the same intensity. Yeah, so it's magic, the way that our minds work. And I'm glad you asked that question, Rosalind. So let's say we experienced a trauma that's arising in the context of a session. So one person that I was working with at one point was talking about this situation and then said, I hate my life. And I said, okay, so we just moved to I hate my life. How old are you? And what's going on? And what are the feelings? And this person had lost their mother and had to make a horrible choice between their mother or their father. And at 13 years old, to put that on a child is just an abominable kind of choice. But there was a tremendous amount of guilt around it. And so going back to that child and bringing the parent even to talk to that child and allow that child to be okay, to recognize that there was no blame from the part of the parent, that there was compassion, that this child was only a child and should not have had to make that kind of decision. And to give that child compassion. And that shifted because the child shifted and the child is still present in its way within us, then we also shift. And it's profound. It does. I love that you use the word transmute, Rosalind, because it does. It transmutes it. The pain becomes something entirely different, and the pain itself disappears and is replaced with some sense of understanding, compassion, acceptance, love. It's super really powerful. And so then the thoughts don't even go down, not even the same intensity. Oftentimes that happens too, is that there's a reduction in intensity. But other times what happens is that there's a whole different emotion that arises, that so initially it might have been guilt and shame, and then maybe it transmutes to sort of it could be a sadness, and then that gets to be addressed, or it could be a sense of peace and acceptance. But the emotions shift. The trigger ends up working very differently. So it's quite remarkable when we use the strength of mind, and particularly like when we recognize we're in a state of misery. And this is the kicker, is you need to be able to recognize this, right? So, but when we recognize it, we can step back to say, is this how I choose to feel right now? And that opens up a whole new world, because then we are not at the effect of that thought loop, like the hamster wheel. We can stand back and say, is this how I choose to feel right now? And what can I consider to feel differently? Or you can just like let that loop run and not buy into it. Maybe stand back and watch the loop and recognize that it's just a loop. It's not the truth. It's not something that we need to fall prey to. That we actually have some choice. So Rosalind says, it would be cool to see where in the brain the neurons are going in the brain when that shift occurs, or is that shift happening in the heart? And that's such a beautiful question. I think that the shift is happening in the entire being, because the head and the heart are connected. And when we think certain thoughts or we feel certain emotions, we have sets of chemicals that and impulses that move throughout the whole system. And I think that fundamentally, maybe the energy that drives the transformation or transmutation is emotional energy. So what's emotion is energy in motion, right? So somehow it's getting fired up and it's going through the whole system. And what I notice in this work, the core connection work, is that the emotions change more quickly than the thought pattern. So I'll often ask people, if you feel into it, what are you noticing versus thinking into it? I remember dealing with a client recently who was speaking in absolutist terms of always and never, and I'm always going to feel this way. And it was really interesting to challenge them in that thinking. Always is a long time. Things are the only constant is change, right? And how do you know that you're always going to be thinking that way? Are there things that you have thought in the past that you no longer think? Are there things that you had certain feelings about in the past that you no longer have those feelings about? So one of the things that I think contributes to our strength of mind is the knowledge that change happens and change is possible, and that the way this is in this moment is not the way it's always going to be. It's unlikely that it's going to continue unchanged. That's kind of the one thing we can count on, is change. So strength of mind. And really what we're talking about is activating our capacity and our commitment to choice. And when we find ourselves going back into that rut again, to choose differently, to create a new rut, to create a new path, really, or to at least loosen the wheels out of that rut so that we can find a different direction. You know, that the rut is just a rut. It's just a habit. It's just a pattern. And habits can be broken. Habits can be changed. And it does take often a deliberate act of will to be able to stand back and choose differently, because we get swept up in it. We get swept up in the passion, the whole, it's like when you watch a movie and you end up crying because you're so immersed in the story, or laughing for that matter, because you're so immersed in that as a reality. But the truth is that it's our perspective that generates our experience, and we can shift that perspective at any moment. And what it takes is that recognition, the standing back, the awareness, to be able to be the observer, and from that moment of observation to choose. And so that's really the foundation of strength of mind, is being able to access that moment of observation, that meta moment, so that we can then make a choice and to choose differently again and again and again and again, as long as it takes, until that new choice becomes more automatic for us. So I think that's it for today. I want to thank you so much for your willingness to engage in these conversations and to question the things that we have operated by, like our operating procedures, to question those things that may have been invisible or previously unquestioned. So much gratitude for you, to you for that. And I'm Mira Rubin. This is the Core Connection. And I go live here each weekday morning at 9 a.m. Eastern on the Enlightened World Network Facebook page and YouTube channel. And I invite you to check out the other awesome programming on Enlightened World Network and Enlightened World Living on the Facebook pages. And until next time,